starts the story, there's an attempt to set a tone, and I think in my particular story, the beginning is the ending, essentially, and my protagonist, Meredith, is in a very wistful place, so I think that the imagery, in that imagery, there's an attempt to evoke that wistfulness.
I really like the fact with the first page of your story that it was very lyrical and poetic, and then I love the fact that you talked about the tight blue pants on the two women, and you realise they're cops, and it just immediately changes this lyrical opening. You think it's almost like David Lynch, you know, you set up this almost suburban idyll, and then the cops arrive. It's like, oh.
Yeah, I like that about your opening as well, Chris, and we were talking earlier on about the way you use semicolons, and you know, without meaning to really, I noticed that you use 7 in your opening paragraph, and it reminds me of like a car, you know, accelerating, and then, you know, after the first paragraph, we hit the road, and then similarly, you come to the end, and you're gearing down, and you use 4 semicolons in your final paragraph again, and it sort of comes back to this, and then it's like the brakes are on.
Semicolons is one of the hardest punctuation marks to use effectively as well.
It's just because I have a semicolon problem.
Semicolonoscopy. Tom Waits, but I think it was Tom Wolfe, once said that, no, it wasn't Tom Wolfe, because he uses them a lot, exclamation marks, to the other punctuation thing. Someone else said you're allowed to use 2 exclamation marks for every 100,000 words you write.
Which is one too many. I do like a writer who can use a semicolon. It's a nice thing to see. I unfortunately have to say we've run out of time. We've got 10. Oh, excellent.
And I have a question.
Yes, please, Heather.
Barry, how could you have ruined my love of wind chimes? I'm in the middle of knitting.
Sorry, I didn't mean to offend anyone that owned wind chimes. Actually, you know, getting back to the whole thing about people thinking stories are about them, a friend of mine said, "You got the wind chime thing from me, right?" I was like, "No, what are you talking about?" I said, "Remember, you always used to talk about how the wind chimes used to annoy you." I had no remembrance of this whatsoever, so stuff must be stored up there. Keep your wind chimes. As long as you keep them in Western Australia, don't bring them over to the
See, you've offended the wind chimes and I've worked so hard. Any other questions? Oh, great. Yes.
You talked about how a short story is like a photograph and a novel is like a film. Have you ever written a short story and wanted to see the film, or make it into like a novel? Like you don't want to give up on your character?
I always cast the actors. I think Natalie Portman for Sylvie. I tend to I guess it's inevitable that we live in 2013, you see things visually, everything's about TV and film in your head. So it's inevitable that when you're writing a story, you're thinking filmically. I am anyway, I can't speak for the other two. But,
yeah, I like to imagine my stories on stage. I like to do soundtracks. Often it's just percussion.
Yeah.
There's often percussion that drives the rhythm of the story, and I like to make that manifest. It's a fantasy.
And my book, 1970 something, did I mention it's still available? I actually wrote that, I made cassettes, because I thought it's 1970s. I made compilation cassettes of songs from the 1970s and played them. I hate playing music while I write, but for that book I wrote the whole thing to a soundtrack of these songs, and occasionally they seeped into the narrative. One whole story revolved around the song 10cc's I'm Not in Love, because I was just obsessed with that song. I thought it just represented 1975. So the story that was particularly about that year revolved around that song. And that in my head, there's a whole movie on that book. Unfortunately, no one's bought the rights yet. But if you know anyone, let me know.
Kristen, you're doing both. You're writing the film and the creating the photograph.
I am, and I certainly don't want to denigrate the form of short story writing because I recognise as it is a real skill to take a still photograph, it is a skill to write a short story. But in terms of the energy and willpower required to finish a novel, particularly with two small children, the short story is like the click of a shutter. For me, I feel that it's a much easier thing to tackle and a much easier thing to resolve.
Yeah. Of course, we thought one is the long distance run and one is the sprint, and it's a joy to be able to actually finish something too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Satisfying.
Was there another question over there? Let me see your hand up. Oh, yes. Yes.
I just was wondering, in the end, do you think that the best short stories are actually the story of someone? You know, even if it's a short story about a relationship and apparently it's about two people and their interactions, are the best stories actually where the writer has more of an emotional connection with one person? Or about a place rather than a person? Is it always someone's story?
I think it's probably a personal preference. I like stories about relationships, about connections between people.
I also like stories about places and people's relationships to places, and in well-evoked short stories that involve an evocative place, that can be like a character as well, and I think that's a particularly Australian phenomenon as well, given the presence of the place we live in here. So I don't know if it has to be a person, but I think that the angle into the story has to have character, even if that's not a person. You get student stories about animals as well, lots of them. Animal people.
I read a great short story that a friend of mine wrote once that was full of drama and relationships and passion and all this stuff, and it ended up being about kitchen appliances. And it was really clever because you made all these assumptions as the story was going along, and then at the end you get this whole wah thing, and you think, wow, it's really clever that he's actually invested these appliances with all these human emotions. So it doesn't necessarily have to be about a person. Plus, we were talking just before we came in about Jennifer Egan's story collection, A Visit from the Goon Squad, and it's connected short stories, and she does one whole story in PowerPoint. The whole story is just flow diagrams.
And I was in tears at the end of it.
Yeah, it's
Amazing.
incredible. Because you'd think, how can you make PowerPoint emotional? And it is an amazing feat that she managed to pull it off. So yeah, I think they can take all different forms and they can be about all sorts of different things. And one of the most humanistic writers, and one of my favourite writers, is Kurt Vonnegut. And he was basically considered a science fiction writer because he worked a lot in that genre. And his most famous book, Slaughterhouse-Five, is about the bombing of Dresden in the war. And he wrote it as this time-travelling narrator called Billy Pilgrim, who travels across time to another planet. And yet it is about the bombing of Dresden in the war. And it's one of the great anti-war books of our time. And yet he wrote it in that form. So I think sometimes people can write a very human story in a completely different format to the one you would think, and it can be much more powerful as a result.
I think we've
A wind chime? I think we've meandered round to figuring out a few